after church, after worship. So worship is going to be special today, and then there's a special dedication of this painting by an African-American painter that's over in the Gathering Place, which we renamed the Faith Gathering Place, not just because gathering helps us with our faith, but because of that name of that previous church, that all historic black church in York that merged in 65 with First. So that's cool. Okay. Anybody at home? We're glad you're here. First Pres, York, Pennsylvania. We're in the 4th or 5th week in a class on peacemaking in the Middle East. We've been looking at the history and the complexity of all of that. As I listen to the news and so forth and the stuff on campuses and so forth, I wish we had time to talk about all that. We're not going to today, but one thing I just want to underscore is that there is not one voice on either side of this issue. You know, there's peacemaking Muslims and there's radical Christians that are Zionists, and there's Jewish peacemakers, and there's jihadist Muslims or secular Muslims that want pluralism and democracy. There's people that are not political at all, just trying to live their lives in both Israel on both sides of the wall. Palestinian children that have been killed by the thousands. So there's no one voice, but one of the voices, one of the kind of complications in any peacemaking conflict resolution, whether it's in the political world of Israel-Palestine or whether it's in on the ground of people in churches and Arab Christians and so forth. One of the problems is that Israel sometimes, Netanyahu not lately because he's pretty secular, but sometimes gives the rhetoric that they've got the right to the land. The Arabs may have lived there previously, but the Jews did too, and God told them it's their land, so they use the Bible to sort of authorize their role in almost whatever anything they do is okay. And so the next 2 weeks, what we want to do is just talk about the Bible a little bit more and about the Jewish tradition and Israel and the Bible and so on. And there's just so much. I mean, the Bible's a big, complicated voice, and it doesn't speak in one voice. So one thing at least we'll kind of enter into the conversation today is a reminder in Brueggemann's little book. It's not real great, but I love Brueggemann. This is not my favorite book of his, but this is a book we're selling for $10 if anybody wants it, called Chosen, Reading the Bible Amidst the Israeli-Palestine Conflict. One of the things we want to say is that you can't just take any one verse of the Bible, Old or New Testament, out of context and apply it to today. You can't even take it out of context back then. Wasn't what the Jews were supposed to do. But even today, thousands of years later, to take something written in so many different eras, there's many voices in the Bible. It's written by hundreds of writers and edited by thousands of scribes and put together over a period of hundreds of years. So it isn't just like the Bible fell out of the sky as God's rule book. It's a text that was poems and stories and parables and put together later. Some of the Moses stuff, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the early part of the Old Testament, happening live, history, some of it. But yet it wasn't compiled until maybe after the exile, thousands of years later, when they finally took these stories and wrote them down and put the scrolls together and finally made them into a Torah, a Bible book for the Jews. So the Bible wasn't even compiled. Who knows when the New Testament was written and Paul's letters, and eventually it gets compiled, put together. Eventually they invented the printing press in the 1500s, and now we got leather Bibles, and everybody has paper readers Bibles in our pews. But the Bible just didn't get written like that. So let's just back up and talk about how complicated it is for anybody to quote the Bible at any time. We're a Bible-believing church. The Presbyterian tradition in our church, pastor preaches on the Bible every week. So we believe the Bible. It's God's word, the Bible says, and we believe that. But it just is complicated. So let's just kind of play with how complicated it is just a little bit, particularly around this claim of whether the Jews get the land, whether God promised them as his chosen people, and that authorizes them to the land. And then a second question is, even if it does, which I don't think it does, but even if it does the secular nation state of Israel in that land therefore have the right to do whatever they want and be persecuting of other people that live there? Which historically they have done since the 1940s and since the 48 war. They took over more land in the 67 war, which they miraculously won through military firepower, some of which came from your tax dollars. We give them billions of dollars every single year. So over the generation, Israel has become a military powerhouse. And they took more land in 67, and now they won't give it back. when it was given to them before the World War II. So it's complicated. So does Israel get a right to the land according to the Bible? And even if they did, do they have the right to do with it whatever they want? And I think the answer to both of those is no. Anyway, let's try to figure that out. I'm going to read a little bit here, and then Stephanie will talk later too. I'm going to read a little bit from this Brueggemann book, just the preface. And again, this will just say what I'm sort of trying to warm up to here. He says, and of course he's mostly an Old Testament scholar. That's what he's known for. In my own thinking, which he says, which is much influenced by my work as a scripture scholar, I begin with a focus on the claim of Israel as God's chosen people. That conviction is not in doubt in the Bible. It is a theological claim, moreover, that fits with compelling persuasiveness the reality of the Jews in the wake of World War II and the Shoah. Shoah is another way of saying the Holocaust. In the late 40s, after the Jews had one of the most evil experiences of the history of the world, the pogroms of Nazi Germany that wiped out millions, anybody with half a heart was sensitive to the need of the Jews, and that as God's people, they needed some kind of land. Of course, as one young person quipped, wouldn't it have been better if they were able to be safe in their own land, which in those days was all throughout Europe? Wouldn't it have been better to let them be safe there instead of saying, okay, we can't let you be safe from anti-Semitism in Europe, so we're going to send you somewhere else where you can be safe, and it wasn't there either. But anyway, he says this idea that Jews had this experience in the wake of World War II. Jews were indeed a vulnerable people whose requirement of a homeland was an overriding urgency. Like many Christians, both progressive and evangelical, I was grateful, and I continue to be so, he says, for the founding and prospering of the state of Israel as an embodiment of God's chosen people. That much is expressed in my earliest book, The Land. Brueggemann wrote a book on the land in the Bible, I'm guessing in the 70s. I took the Holy Land to be the appropriate place for the chosen people of the Bible, which anticipates the well-being of Israel that takes land and people together. And then he says, of course, much has changed since then in the linkage between the state of Israel and the destiny of the chosen people of God. For instance, the state of Israel has evolved into an immense military power, presumably with a nuclear capacity. There is no doubt that such an insistence on military power has been in part evoked by a hostile environment in which the state of Israel lives, including periodic attacks by their neighboring states. So they've become a military powerhouse, and he implies, and it maybe is understandable, at least part of that is because they have been under attack by everybody that hates them in their region, in their neighborhood. The state of Israel has escalated and continues to escalate its occupation of the West Bank by an aggressive development of new settlements, and we talked about that last week, what the settlements were. The state of Israel has exhibited a massive indifference to the human rights of Palestinians. So there are three things that Brueggemann asserts: that they've become a military powerhouse, that they have escalated their occupation through settlements, continued doing the land grabs. If you have a Bible with one of those indexes in the back, look up land grabs. There's land grabs in the Bible, and it's bad when you steal somebody's land. The state of Israel has exhibited an indifference to the human rights of Palestinians. That's what he claims. Thus, he seems to me that the state of Israel, in its present inclination and strategy, not expect positive play from its identity as God's chosen people. As a consequence, my own judgment is that its important initiatives must be taken to secure the human rights of Palestinians. This changed stance on my part is reflected in the new edition of my old book on the land. It is a change, moreover, that is featured in the thinking of many critics who have been and continue to be fully committed to the security of the state of Israel, as I am. So he says he's still committed to the safety of Israel, and many critics of Israel are still committed to that. Remember, we talked about that pro. We want to be pro-Palestinian, pro-Israeli, and pro-peace. This rethinking is important, he says, both for political reasons and for fundamental interpretive reasons as we interpret the Bible. A change in attitude and policy is important to help us resolve the conflict. It is clear enough that the state of Israel will continue to show little restraint in its actions toward Palestinians. He wrote this before the war, the current war. As long as the U.S. policy gives it a blank check along with financial backing. Such one-sided and unconditional support for the state of Israel is not finally in the interest of any party. For peace will come only with the legitimation of the political reality of both Israelis and Palestinians. As long as this issue remains unaddressed, destabilization will continue to be a threat in the larger region. It will not do for Christian readers of the Bible to reduce the Bible to an ideological prop for the secular state of Israel, as though support for Israel were a final outcome of the biblical testimony. The dynamism, the dynamic unfolding power of the Bible, the dynamism of the Bible, with its complex interactions of the chosen people and other peoples, is fully shown, and we will do well to see what is going on in the Bible itself that is complex and cannot be reduced to a simplistic defense of chosenness. The Bible itself knows better than that. He goes on, he says, "It is my hope that the Christian community in the United States will cease to appeal to the Bible as a direct support for the state of Israel and will have the courage to deal with the political realities without being cowed by accusations of anti-Semitism." Remember, we said that early on, that anti-Semitism is bad. Being against the political policies of the secular state of Israel is not necessarily the same thing as anti-Semitism. And many Jews themselves are opposed to the Gaza war, so that's sort of what he's saying there. It is my further hope that the U.S. will become more vigorous advocates for human rights for all and will urge the U.S. government to back away from its one-dimensional ideology for the sake of political realism. Anyway, he goes on and says, "I've not changed my mind one iota about the status of Israel as God's chosen people or about the urgency for the security and well-being of the state of Israel. Certainly, the Christian West continues to have much to answer for in its history of anti-Semitic attitudes and policies. None of that legacy, however, ought to cause blindness or indifference to the political reality and the way in which uncriticized ideology does enormous damage to prospects for peace and the hopes of historical possibilities. The attempt to frame the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in terms of anti-Semitism is unpersuasive. More courage and honesty are required amidst the realities of human domination and human suffering." As the hymn writer James Russell Lowell wrote back in his hymn about the Civil War, "New occasions teach new duties." The current conflict, with the escalation of cynical violence, is a new occasion, and new duties are now required. Well, that's kind of how Brueggemann starts off the introduction to his book. Sorry, I just felt like I needed to read that since we're talking about the book. Here's one story he tells, or one kind of Bible thing he gets into early on in the first chapter. He notes that various Bible teachers teach a variety of things in a multitude of ways. It does not speak in a single voice. He says part of the task of modern Christian faithful Bible interpretation is to acknowledge the variety of the often competing positions found in the Bible itself. Fair enough? We have to kind of work with the tensions of this law says that, but this law implies that. This verse says that, but this letter seems to undo it. Jesus said, "You heard it said, but I now tell you." I mean, there's just a lot of complex voices there. And so you get that, whether violence, there's times when violence is used in the Bible, there's times when Jesus says turn the other cheek. Slavery seems to be condoned at one point, but obviously is undone by the New Testament. The role of women, the role of gay and lesbians. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can debate about and have a good, honest conversation on what the Bible implies by this verse and that verse and that verse. So there's no one singular thing. There are in the Bible traditions where one author will say this, Moses or somebody, and then 100 years later, the prophet, somebody, Isaiah, will say, "As Moses said," and then other guys will quote, "But as Leviticus says." So they're quoting different sources and then playing with them. Sort of like, I don't want to say Republicans and Democrats today, but different people will cite the Constitution, right? But they'll cite different parts of the Constitution in different ways. And so you end up with different political parties citing the same sources, but interpreting them differently and quoting different parts of the same book. Well, that's what the Jews did with the prophets as hundreds of years rolled on, is different prophets. We're in this Wednesday night Bible study online on Zoom. You should come to this. It's every Wednesday night. It's open to anybody. You don't have to know anything. You just show up and we read the Bible out loud and talk about it. But often we find in the New Testament, they're quoting the Old Testament. And then we look up that Old Testament verse and we're like, what the heck? That doesn't sound like the same quote. Like they're playful in the way they interpret and creatively interpret the text. They don't just quote it out of context, they just quote it. But sometimes you have to look at it and say, well, they're kind of giving that a new spin. We didn't think that. Or Linda or somebody will say, well, where does it say that? We'll go look it up. We can't even find it. And so the New Testament will say, as the law says, and we're like, well, where does the law say that? So the interpretive moves that the Bible does throughout its own way is just the way it works. See, Jews understand that. The way Jews interpret the Bible is mainly through argument. They just argue about stuff all the time. It's really true. They have a name for it. It's called midrash, where they'll tell a story and then somebody else will tell another story interpreting the Bible, and then they write those down. Some Jews quote the midrashic material more than they quote the scriptures themselves because it's an ongoing conversation about trying to figure out what it means. Does that make sense?
The Recovery Bible.
Yeah.
What you're talking about, the two different Bibles,
Yeah.
how does this relate to what you're saying?
Okay, the Holy Bible that Christians use today, Old and New Testament, is a standard Bible. The Recovery Bible puts those recovery notes in it, and that's sort of what I'm saying. They add those interpretations through the lens of AA and adding some AA recovery insight to saying, hey, maybe this text is implying this, and in your recovery movement, you can get it. It makes sense. And so different interpreters will get a different thing out of God's holy word. I'm not saying it's not God's word, but interpreters kind of understand it differently, and some get off the wall and say all kind of wacky stuff about it, and it's like, well, that can't be true. That nobody thinks that. But even within the realm of good conversation, different people can kind of get different things out of it. And the recovery movement takes all those study notes and puts all those mentions, those little notes in it. That's not part of the Bible. That's somebody adding those notes in. But that's like what Jews do, this midrash process where they talk about it and argue about it and try to figure it out. Well, here's just one example of how that works in the Bible. This is what I want to get to. You know how it works. There's the scriptures that teach about Abraham hearing a covenantal promise from God that he's going to become the father and mother, he and Sarah and Abraham, of a great nation. They're going to have a huge offspring, and they're going to bless the rest of the world. It's for the sake of the world, but they're going to be a huge nation. That's the beginning. It's in Genesis 12. Well, eventually they had some kids, and then Moses shows up. They get conquered by Pharaoh and his pyramids, and Moses comes up and says, let my people go, and they go off into the wilderness. Eventually they get to cross the promised land, and they have battles, and they get some land. And then they have judges, and then they want to be like everybody else, so they want kings, and then eventually they get some kings. So by the middle of the Old Testament, they're an empire. It's the Davidic, majestic powerhouse in the Middle East, in the Iron Age. And so David's their king, the monarchy as they call it. And lo and behold, they start fighting. Prophets show up and say, you guys are worshiping wrong, you're doing injustice. That's the two things you hear the most in the Old Testament. The poor and the oppressed are being ripped off, economic sins, and you're not worshiping well, sins against religious holiness. There's idolatry and there's injustice. They almost always go together. Whenever there's idolatry and you put something more important than God, it does not go well for the culture. And so there's injustice and there's idolatry. And they warn them, and different factions line up, and they have a civil war. In biblical language, they call it the divided kingdom, right? You've heard of the divided kingdom. There's a civil war between the north and the south. Judah is the one nation. They're named after the 12 tribes. Israel is the other nation, and they divide. Jerusalem is in the south in Judah. Judah is where we get the name for Jewish. Jerusalem eventually becomes their capital city. It's often called Zion. We're going to look at that next week. Zion becomes the capital city of the South. I mean, it's like Birmingham, versus Yankee territory. So you got to divide in the Civil War. You got to divide. And both are conquered. One by the Babylonians, the other one by the Assyrians, and they're taken off. The promises of God to be with them, to be the chosen people, to be their protector, to be in the holy city, to have a temple. It used to be a tabernacle, and then it became a temple. David and Solomon made the temple, and that's where God lived, that God was going to be with them. It's destroyed. The Hebrew word is Ichabod. It means he's gone. It's a hell of a bad part of the Bible. There's nothing going on anymore. It's empty. God is gone. The temple's destroyed. The city's hardly there anymore. All the religious leaders in the intellectual class, they left some poor people behind, but most people are in Babylon. The Bible picks up the story in the Babylonian captivity of the one half. The other half sort of disappear for a while. The Assyrians conquered them and took them to Persia or wherever. But the rest of the story continues in exile. And that becomes one of the big parts of the Old Testament. So they got the creation, the covenant, the nation, the civil war, and then they're taken into exile. What this does is it makes everybody wonder, I thought we were God's chosen people. I thought we had God's promises. I thought God was going to be with us. And now it doesn't seem to be true anymore. There's sad psalms they sang in Babylon, songs like we should just hang up our harps on the trees because we can't even sing our praise songs anymore. Where is God in the midst of all this? He's nowhere. And you have these laments. You have a whole book of the Bible called Lamentations that Jeremiah wrote, lamenting the destruction of their homeland. The notion of the exile is so important in the Jewish mentality and in the biblical story, and we don't do nearly enough about it. Some of the prophets, we've had this Sunday school class before, some of you remember, some of the prophets were before the exile warning about it, saying if we don't repent, things are going to go south and things are going to go bad, and the people didn't listen to them. There were a few guys like Ezekiel that were there during the exile, and they were a crazy bunch trying to keep the hope alive. And then there were others that came after the exile. Because guess what? One time a pagan king named Cyrus shows up and said, why are all these Jews in Babylon? Let them go home. Free at last. They get to go back to make a way through the highway, and they get to make a highway through the desert, and they go home to rebuild Jerusalem, even though Jerusalem's hardly there anymore. So you get that story, Well, here's where I want to go with this. After the exile, there's a couple of generations of prophets who are trying to figure out what in the heck just happened to them. Why did they go into exile? What really happened? And some of them said, well, like Deuteronomy, we were supposed to welcome the poor and the oppressed and love our neighbor and do justice in the land, and we didn't do that. We need to be more caring. Other guys, like Ezra, who in Jewish tradition is esteemed almost as much as Moses, Ezra became the leader. He and Nehemiah was the architect that was rebuilding the wall and rebuilding the temple, and there's this book, Nehemiah, about them rebuilding stuff after exile. He was the architect that was doing the work. Ezra was the spiritual leader. And you know what he said? You can look it up. Ezra says, the reason we went into exile is because we married foreign wives. And so we need purity. So what you got to do is unmarry your wives and send them the heck back to wherever they came from. There was a massive disruption under the time of Ezra in families. It's in Ezra 9, 1-4, or again, it's described in Nehemiah 13, where they had to get rid of their foreign wives. Look it up if you don't believe me there. In Ezra 9:2, he refers to the Jewish people as a holy seed. It's translated in most English Bibles as a holy race. So Jews get their sense that they're a holy, pure people, that their seed has to remain pure, which means you can't mix with anybody else, and even if you're married to somebody else, you got to send them back. Other prophets, you surmise, now this is all complicated because the prophets are put in these little books separate. You don't know which one lived in which time, so you need commentaries to figure it out. We got commentaries in our church library. We sell them at Hearts and Minds. You need books about these prophets to figure out what they're even saying, but what you kind of eventually figure out, because they're not in order historically in the Bible. I don't know why, but they're not. You got to figure out which ones came before the exile, which ones came after the exile, by looking at what kings they mentioned and stuff and figuring it out. It's complicated. But biblical commentators tell us that some of the prophets said no. What really has to happen is we have to rebuild our new city with justice for everybody. Isaiah talks about a new city where little kids will grow up to be a healthy age. There won't be urban poverty. They talk about taking homeless people into your home. They talk about stopping the struggle in Isaiah 58 between labor and management. They talk about building a new creation, a beloved community where everybody's treated well and where old people get to live a long time because they don't get sick because there's urban health. So you have the end of the Old Testament, particularly, like say, the end of the prophet Isaiah, envisioning a new Jerusalem that is built on justice and mercy and including everybody. Ezra comes along and says, no, we got to rebuild a city that's pure and holy, and to itself, because we're a holy seed. This debate goes on through the end of the Old Testament. Which one's right? One quotes Deuteronomy a lot about justice. The other one quotes Leviticus a lot about purity and holy. The Levites were a holy nation. You see, they're both quoting Old Testament stuff that's true. Holiness and justice. It's kind of supposed to be both and. But there's some guys drawing on the Levitical tradition wanted a new Jerusalem as they rebuilt after the exile that was just and merciful and kind and full of shalom. The other tradition wanted exclusionary policies that said, no, we've got to be a holy seed. Does that sort of make sense? That's the debate you have and the tensions at the end of the Old Testament. Well, it ends up that the guys that followed the purity teachings of Ezra became known as the Pharisees. They were the New Testament Jews that were like seriously committed to doing everything by the book. And then this guy Jesus shows up, God in the flesh, and guess who his number one enemy was? Not the outsiders, not the other side, the Pharisees. Jesus ended up not siding with Ezra. Jesus ends up siding with 2nd Isaiah, or the third portion of Isaiah. It seems to me. Jesus over and over again upturns the Pharisees' apple cart, saying that religious purity is not worth a darn thing unless it's also committed to justice. Well, how Jesus plays that out is yet another story. But let me just use as one example of this the book. Oh, what I'll do is I'll read Brueggemann again. He talks about this just a little bit, and you'll see how the Bible itself has various views on this stuff. Sorting out the sort of debate between Ezra and Amos, say, is just one little way to get at this. But here's how Brueggemann describes this kind of phase. He says there's an ambiguity. Ambiguity means, you can see it both sides. There's ambiguity about the role of outsiders, the enemy, the other people, the outsiders that runs through Judaism, as it does in the Christian faith in a somewhat different way. He said we should not, however, miss the emphasis on peoplehood that results in a one dimension of Judaism as a rather hard-nosed conviction about one people and one land to the exclusion of everybody else. We shouldn't miss that in the Bible, particularly after exile, particularly from Ezra. Thus, the exclusion of the foreign women becomes something of a symbol or a metaphor for the maintenance of purity that led as well to the purity of the land, the seed, to the exclusion of anybody else from that land. Judaism also had and continues to have another interpretive trajectory that makes welcome room for others. In the post-exilic period, such openness is shown in the story of Jonah. And we did a Sunday school class of that 4 or 5 years ago. We studied Jonah. And of course, Jonah is going to this evil empire, Nineveh, and they were evil, who did all kind of awful stuff. And we learned that God loves them too. And Jonah can't imagine it. He doesn't even want to preach to them. And so he goes out in the belly of the whale, he finally comes back and says, all right, already, the whale spit him back up. He's like, I'll go do my thing. And he goes and preaches to them kind of reluctantly. And they get converted. Nineveh, even the animals, it says. The land of Nineveh. So the story of Jonah is written during the post-exilic period, implying that, wait a minute, this purity stuff isn't all there is. In the original covenant with Genesis, God's chosenness was for the sake of the world. It was a missionary covenant, blessed to be a blessing. And let's not forget that. So Jonah, I'm sending you to just about the worst place around, to the Nazis up in Nineveh. And Jonah says, really? You love them too? Jonah. Okay, so that's written in the post-exilic period. And openness is shown where God shows mercy to Nineveh by sending Jonah to the perceived enemy of ancient Israel. In the narrative of Ruth that gets written, little book Ruth gets written about that. In our Bible study, we studied that on Wednesday night a couple of years ago. Again, outsiders, right? You know the story of Ruth. Who's she? She's a Moabite, right? So much for the holy seed we have in Jesus' own lineage, because she is in the lineage of David. It's written in post-exilic times, but it's telling the story before David. And you have in David's genealogy an unpure Moabite. How about that? In the narrative, Ruth explains that David has a Moabite or a non-Jewish mother, and in violation of the holy seed. In Isaiah 56, part of the concerns that welcome the foreigners and the eunuchs, sexually mixed up, two populations that jeopardize purity, and they're welcomed in, and includes the promise that my house, in this Isaiah 56 verse 7, shall be a house of prayer for who? For all people. So even in Isaiah, you have this vision that the temple itself is now open to everybody. Jesus quotes that verse, by the way, when he's kicking the money changers out of the temple. He quotes this exact text that the temple is supposed to be for everybody. So there are these trajectories in the text that give us this sense that Ezra isn't completely right about the things. That he has got a passionate insight and God used him as a leader, but there's more to the story than just Ezra, send back your unholy wives and that'll take care of the problem. There's more going on in this trajectory towards welcoming the others in things like Jonah, in things like Ruth, in things like the direct teaching from the prophet Isaiah about eunuchs, about others, about the weirdos, about the nobodies. They get welcomed in. That's what church is supposed to be. Okay. Let me just take one more time. Do we have time, Steph? What time is it? Before I turn it over to you. Let's just look quickly at the book of Amos. I don't know if you read Old Testament prophets. They're all weird, and who understands them? But man, Amos is a character. In the beginning of the book of Amos, you can look it up if you want, or you can just trust me on this. In the book of, at the beginning of Amos, he uses this line that God's going to judge other nations. For 3 sins and 4, he says, I'm going to judge you. And then the next paragraph, for 3 sins and 4, I'm going to judge somebody else. There's a lot of smiting going on here. He's mad at this country. He's going to hate this country. He's going to demolish this country. And he tells them some of what their sins were and what he's going to do to them. So Amos, who was not a professional prophet, he was a farmer from Tekoa. He was a sheep herder. And he lived in the south, came to the north, or the other way around. He was probably from the rural area, comes into Jerusalem. This is right before the exile. And he's warning them. And the first 2 chapters of Amos is this same poetic structure. For 3 sins and 4, I will not revoke my punishment against you. And he names the names of the different outfits he's judging. And guess what? It's not Israel. It's all these pagan nations. And one of them, interestingly enough, is Gaza, which is itself kind of interesting. And so in Amos, he's criticizing from Zion, from the city of Jerusalem, Damascus, Gaza, Tyre, Edom, Ammon, Moab, all these pagan nations. I just want to say this about this. It's odd, or it's interesting, that God's holy word and principles written into the very created order, the way the world really is, God wants every nation to be righteous. The Jews have a special covenantal obligation to show God's ways to the world, but no nation gets off the hook. If you're a pagan nation, you can't go do whatever you want. In one case, they're grabbing land. In one case, they rip open pregnant women. They're violating even the unborn in their war. So all this violent war, land grabbing, lack of justice of these pagan nations are called in the carpet. So whether you're a religious nation or not, God is still the sovereign of history and still notices injustice when he sees it and breaks his heart. Okay? And then after this kind of broad historical name in every country in the region, in chapter 2 he gets to Judah, and then he gets to Israel. Remember the divided kingdom? So he's at both sides of the kingdom now, critiquing them as well. So each one of these, and here's the kind of things Amos says that Judah and Israel do. They sell the righteous for money and the needy for a pair of sandals. Those who pant the very dust of the earth on the head of the helpless and turn away the humble. A man and his father resort to the same woman. They take garments as pledges. That means like credit. You know, there's cheap creditors They take pledges and stretch out beside every altar, which they weren't supposed to do. There's this sense of economic injustice that they're putting away people that needed loan and charging them too much. They're selling a credit for a pair of sandals. It goes on in chapter 2. He calls the fancy suburban women of Jerusalem, he calls them fat cows. You cows of Bashan who are on the mountains in Samaria, you oppress the poor and you crush the needy. You say to your husbands, bring me more that we can now drink. The Lord has sworn by his holiness, behold, the days are coming when you will be taken away. In verse 10, it says, of chapter 5, it says, they hate those who reprove by the gate. That's an old way of saying it. The gate was where the courts were. In other words, they hate justice. They hate when courts are ruling things. Just like the international courts have all said, Israel, you've got to stop the war in Gaza. Almost every nation in the world. They don't care. They don't care what the world court says. They abhor those who speak with integrity. Therefore, you impose heavy rent on the poor and exact a tribute of grain, extra grain from them. You have built your houses of well-hewn stone, but you won't live on them. You have planted pleasant vineyards, yet you will not drink that wine. Because, verse 12, you turn aside the poor in the courts or in the gate. Seek good and not evil, that you may live, and thus may the Lord of hosts be with you. Just as you have said, hate evil, love good, establish justice in the courts. Perhaps the Lord of hosts will be gracious to this remnant of Jacob. In verse 6, chapter 6, woe to those who are at ease in Zion, those that are middle class and comfortable, and those who feel secure in the mountains of Samaria, the distinguished men of the foremost of nations to whom the house of Israel comes. They recline on beds of ivory and sprawl on their couches. They eat lambs from the flock and calves from the midst of the stall, who improvises to the sound of our harp, just like David. I loathe this arrogance, he says in verse 8 of chapter 6. I detest his citadel. Other translations say his forts or his fortresses. Therefore, I deliver up this city and all it contains. You see, God is furious about the injustice and the social arrangements of wealth and power in the nation of Israel and says he's not going to have it. A country or a nation that is built on economic injustice against its neighbors and stealing land and living high in the hog, Jerusalem often prides itself in being the best city in the Middle East. These Middle Eastern injustices are not God does not look light on them. And so Amos's ongoing attack on the landholders of ancient Israel and saying God's going to destroy you because of this. He even then goes to the worship people who are worshiping and not paying attention to what's happening out in the streets. And he says, God says through Amos in chapter 5 in verse 21, I reject your religious festivals, nor do I take delight in your solemn services. Even though you offer me up burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. I won't even look at the offerings of your fatlings. Take away from me the songs, the noise of your praise songs. I will not even listen to the sound of your harps. But what did he want? You know the next verse. It's verse 24. But let justice roll down like waters, and let righteousness flow in the land like an ever-flowing stream. That was Martin Luther King's favorite verse. Let justice roll down like a mighty river. See, if the church services aren't even caring about what's going on in the world, Amos says, God doesn't even want to hear your lousy worship services. This is scary stuff, isn't it? So for Israel to say, then or now, we own the land, God is with us, we get to do whatever we want, is just biblically not plausible. Well, anyway, there's a lot of voices in the Bible. The stuff at the end of the Old Testament, they're trying to figure out why they went into exile, what sins caused them the most trouble, and what they need to do if they're going to rebuild a new religious community, or what they call a new Jerusalem. That becomes ending up being what they call eschatological, which means it looks to the future. The new community, the beloved community at the end of the Old Testament, ends up being a picture of heaven. It's something we're never going to see, and they're never going to build until Jesus comes back and makes it so, and Jesus is the one that brings that. Well, that's just one piece of this story. Steph's going to bring us home with just a little bit more, and then we'll have some conversation next week about all this.
Well, thank you. That's very helpful. And it's this important reminder of the ways that the Bible really does speak with these multiple voices and how we try to figure out how we interpret them in light of each other. Very helpful. Thank you, thank you. So what we're going to do in our last 10 minutes here is look a little bit further at some stuff from this book by Walter Brueggemann that some of you have. And we're going to focus a little bit on the themes from chapter 3, if anybody is following along. And this is going to be a really quick run through because we only have about 10 minutes and we could spend much more time on this. But we're going to look a little bit at the history of how the land is this important theological concept in the Old Testament, and how that may or may not influence how we think about events today. You alluded to this a little bit, but chapter 3 in this book, I think, does a helpful breakdown of just sort of walking through the different ways that land is theologically important in the Old Testament, and how that becomes sort of a significant theme in the Jewish people's relationship with God. So we start off with this idea of very early in the Old Testament of land being given as a gift. We see in the story of Abram in Genesis chapter 12. In verse 1, the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." So the sort of earliest story of the beginning of God's people has to do with this promise of going to a land. And then that promise is reiterated to Abram's son Isaac in Genesis 26, verses 3 to 4. God says to Isaac, "To you and to your descendants I will give all these lands, and I will fulfill the oath that I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your offspring as numerous as the stars of heaven, and will give to your offspring all these lands." And then again, we see this promise repeated to Isaac's son Jacob. This is Genesis 28:13, and God says, "The land on which you lie, I will give to you and to your offspring." So from the very first chapter of the Bible, we have this promise of God giving land to this chosen people. And then this promise gets reiterated to Moses in the book of Exodus, when the people are taken captive by Pharaoh in Egypt, and there is this movement that God liberates them from slavery through the work of Moses, takes them in the wilderness, and they are on their way to the promised land. And then in Exodus chapter 3:8, God continues to reiterate this promise that you will be going to this promised land, and that keeps them hopeful as they are sojourning through the wilderness, facing all of the difficulties there. But even though all of these promises are articulated as gifts, the land is something that God is giving, it also becomes really clear soon that it's a little more complicated than that. That not only is the land given, but as the people are wandering in the wilderness after the Exodus, we get this book of Deuteronomy. And the book of Deuteronomy, we have these extended speeches of Moses. And Moses basically sets forth a set of commandments that the people have to keep if this promise of land is going to be retained. Deuteronomy 6:18, for example, says, "Do what is right and good in the sight of the Lord, so that it may go well with you, and so that you may go in and occupy the good land that the Lord swore to your ancestors to give you." And then we, in the Deuteronomy chapter 28 kind of becomes the culmination of this. We get this long list of blessings and curses in which obedience to the Torah becomes a prerequisite for holding the land. So it becomes clear that this now sort of complicates what seemed like an unconditional promise to the early patriarchs, has now become something that is more complicated, more conditional, that this extensive list of commands, of ways of living with God and living with one another, have to be kept in order to keep the land. Here's what Brueggemann says. He writes, "Thus we may conclude that the land is given to Israel unconditionally, but it is held by Israel conditionally. It is given to Israel unconditionally, but it is held by Israel conditionally. We may also conclude that this unmistakable tension in the tradition ensures that different advocates will be drawn to different texts, as we were discussing in the first section here. Both this promise that God gives freely, but that in order to keep it, it takes faithfulness." And then Brueggemann continues, "The Deuteronomic if," that's a great phrase, the Deuteronomic if, becomes a primary theme among the prophets of the 8th and 7th centuries BCE. In their various speeches of judgment, the prophets voice indictment of Israel for violation of the Torah, a failure to practice justice and holiness, and they conclude that the land of promise will only be held if the Torah is honored, as we heard a bit about earlier. So the land is given, the land is held conditionally, and this is where the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah, ends. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are known as the Torah and are sort of the core of the Jewish canon. And they end as the people are wandering in the wilderness, about to enter the promised land, but they haven't gone in yet. And that's where the life of Moses ends. Brueggemann says this: "The 5 books of the Torah, the most authoritative textual tradition in the Hebrew Bible, ends before Israel enters the land. See Deuteronomy 34:4. That is, Israel's original or earliest tradition is not about having the land, it is about anticipating the land. At that point of anticipation, the Torah ends, as does the life of Moses." And of course, there is more to the story, but it does seem significant that the ending of the Torah is there, on the verge, anticipating the promised land, but not being there yet. So the land is given, the land is held conditionally. Then in the book of Joshua, we see that the land is taken by force. And in this historical description of the battles, it becomes obvious that this land isn't empty, that there are, in fact, people already living there. And there's a lot of violence in this section of the Bible. It is portrayed as, when they do claim the promised land, it is portrayed as being the fulfillment of God's promises. But it also is portrayed as being something that requires continued faithfulness to maintain. So this same idea of the if that appears in Deuteronomy before entering the promised land, we hear reiterated in Joshua. This is Joshua 23:16, where God says, "If you transgress the covenant of the Lord your God, which he enjoined on you, and go and serve other gods and bow down to them, then the anger of the Lord will be kindled against you, and you shall perish quickly from the good land that has been given to you." So land is given, land is held conditionally, land is taken by force, land is losable. And in fact, we eventually see that happening in the exile, as we discussed. And prophets arguing about why that happened. And then the land again is promised, which we see in 2 Chronicles then, in this return, this homecoming. So the land in the Old Testament, in the story of the Jewish people in the Bible, has lots of different facets to it. It's a gift, it also comes with obligations. It is promised, it's also losable. So there's a lot of complicated things going on. So this raises some questions for us today about how does the current land of Israel relate to the land that was promised and given and lost and taken and claimed and reclaimed, and are these the same thing? How do we read these Bible stories in light of current events and current geography? And we're going to talk more about that next week. But just by way of a little bit of a teaser here, one thing that Brueggemann says can help us make sense of all of this is remembering that even during the exile, not all of the Jewish people were super keen to return. Then they had, in fact, developed really robust traditions of worship as an exile people. And the various theological traditions had grown up that made the land not the only central thing, but that also the text and the Word of God became a sort of central rallying point. Brueggemann says, one compelling alternative to land theology is the recognition that Judaism consists most elementally in interpretation of and obedience to the Torah in its requirements of justice and holiness. Such intense adherence to the Torah can be done anywhere at all. Thus, land theology is, at least in some traditions of Judaism, relativized by the recognition that Judaism is a religion of the book, the Torah, and consists in the practice and interpretation of texts. Robert Alter has noted that Judaism is primarily a culture of interpretation that refuses absolutizing any conclusions from the text. And we may assume that this includes absolutizing conclusions about the land. The relativizing of the land promise permits the thought that the practice of Torah reaches beyond tribal or ethnic identity of a sectarian kind. So, the land is clearly important in the Old Testament. The land is also clearly complicated. And so how do we understand the Holy Land in light of current events and in light of the Bible and in light of the way that Jewish practice has developed to not only be centered on the land, but also be centered on interpretation and practice of the Word of God in the Torah? So we're going to pick up there next week. It's complicated. We're going to try to listen to some Jewish voices. Brueggemann is a Christian Old Testament scholar, just to be clear about where he's coming from. And again, just as there are various views about most anything within Christianity, there are various views within Judaism, but we're going to try to work through some of this more next week. Any final thoughts?